Welcome to episode 7 of our series on business cycles. Having defined the theoretical model and the rules of evidence, today we begin the historical verification process by examining the first era of capitalism, 1787 to 1842, and the Kondratieff cycle of the Industrial Revolution.
It really feels like we've spent the last few deep dives meticulously crafting this perfect theoretical lens. And now, finally, we get to look through it.
And what we're looking at is the messiness of actual history.
Exactly. Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We have this massive stack of historical source material. We're deep in Chapter 6 of the core research, and we're going to test the triple wave schema against, the reality of that first great industrial upswing.
And that reality is anything but clean.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the period between, say, the American Revolution and the 1840s, all you see on the surface is just chaos, political chaos.
Complete chaos.
You've got the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, embargoes, the War of 1812, these huge financial panics.
Yeah.
It's really easy for a traditional historian to look at that and argue that any economic fluctuation was just a reaction to these spectacular political shocks.
And that's the critical challenge, isn't it? Our whole goal here is to look past those surface disturbances, past the explosions, the battles, the really spectacular crises, and identify the deep underlying industrial process.
The engine underneath the noise.
The engine.
Well.
We want to find the structural changes that were actually generating these economic waves, which, if our model holds up, should follow a predictable, long rhythm, regardless of the political noise.
This means we have to approach history in a very specific way. You can't just look at the last 25 or 50 years of data if you're talking about cycles like these.
Absolutely not. That's a fool's errand. The methodological requirement here is it's pretty rigid. For studying economic cycles, especially the long ways, you have to understand that economic change is inherently slow. It's profoundly historical. You need a minimum of 250 years of quantitative and dated history. A minimum. If you only look at the modern era, you'll mistake a recessionary phase for a permanent flaw in the system, or you'll see a short boom and think you've found a new paradigm.
A new economy.
We've all heard that before. We're not just looking for correlations in a spreadsheet here. We need a reasoned, comprehensive history of the entire economic process, industrial, financial, and institutional, all of it.
Which also means we can't just stop at the big aggregate curves. The price index, the total output of pig iron. Those high-level stats can hide the very thing we're trying to find.
They hide everything. We need the micro story. We need to understand how one specific industry emerges, who funds it, how it behaves cyclically over generations. If we only look at bank failures and stock market crashes, we're just looking at the froth on the wave.
So we have to go deeper.
We have to descend into the detail, into the stories of the Beverly Cotton Manufactory or the Passaic Falls Project or the exact moment the puddling process for iron showed up in America. We need to know who got the land grant, who gave the first loan, and how quickly the innovation spread. That granular detail is what confirms the process.
Okay, so before we jump into the timeline for this first wave, this K1, we have to lay down the foundation we're working from, specifically our operational definition of capitalism, because it's fundamental to the whole cycle theory.
It's non-negotiable. If you don't define the engine correctly, you can't possibly understand its rhythm. So we're defining capitalism institutionally. It is not just a system with private property and wage labor. Lots of societies had that.
Right, that's too broad.
Far too broad. For our purposes, capitalism is the form of private property economy where innovations are carried out by means of borrowed money, which generally implies the creation of credit.
I think that formulation is so powerful because it immediately draws a bright line between, say, a system of free markets and a truly capitalistic one. You could have a society of artisans and small farmers. They have private property, they might hire labor. But if their growth is only funded by their own savings, by retained earnings, it might be a market economy, but it's not capitalism in this schema.
That is the core implication. It connects the economic cycle directly to the very structure of the society. Think about it. If innovation, the introduction of new ways of doing things, is the engine of growth,
which is our central premise.
It is. And if those new enterprises can't rely on money that's already been saved up, because there's often not enough of it, then they have to pull resources from the future. And that is precisely what credit creation, the fundamental mechanism of banking, lets you do.
So the mechanism of innovation is inherently tied to the mechanism of credit creation. And you can't separate either of them from the economic cycle itself. The boom is the expansion of credit. to finance all this new stuff.
And the bust is the necessary liquidation of that credit when the innovation either fails or, just as importantly, when it succeeds and matures.
Right.
This is why the economic process of a capitalist society is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the series of events that create the cycle. Credit isn't just some helpful add-on, it is the institutional engine.
And if we use that definition, it really pushes the start date for capitalism much, much further back than the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, much further.
Right.
We're not talking about the 1780s. We're talking about the medieval period in Southern Europe.
The late 12th, early 13th century, right?
Exactly. That's when you start to find the practical existence of things like negotiable credit instruments and the institutions of deposit banking, things that allow for the transfer of deposits and the creation of credit in a way that can fund new risky ventures.
So K1, this 1787 to 1842 period, isn't the start of capitalism?
No, not at all. It's the start of its modern, mechanized industrial phase. The underlying financial DNA was already centuries old.
That distinction is crucial. It shows that the financial infrastructure evolved continuously, which brings us perfectly to the second big theoretical tension we need to resolve. This paradox of continuity versus discontinuity.
Yes. This is a tension that plagues any historian looking at long-term change. Our cycle theory, the whole Schumpeterian framework, it stresses the discontinuity of evolution.
The shocks, the jumps.
The successive revolutions of innovation. We focus on these big waves where old systems are suddenly made obsolete.
When you study history up close, microscopically, it just seems like a story of smooth, continuous, almost agonizingly slow accumulation. You know, great inventions like the steam engine or the power loom, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were a synthesis of countless small steps, tweaks, prior ideas stretching back centuries.
Of course.
So how do we reconcile the disruptive shock with the steady accumulation? They seem to be in direct conflict.
It's all about your perspective. It's the difference between the microscopic and the macroscopic view. Let's take an example. Think about the move from using water power to adopting electricity in the 1890s. From the viewpoint of, say, a textile firm manager in Lowell, Massachusetts, who has to decide whether to ditch his water turbine for a new General Electric motor, that decision is a clear, discontinuous step. He is creating an entirely new production function for his factory, literally overnight.
That's the entrepreneurial leap, the discontinuity that we focus on.
That's our unit of analysis. But if a historian stands way back and looks at the last 500 years of energy sources, from water mills in the 16th century to early steam to centralized electrification, the overall trajectory looks like a smooth, continuous, uninterrupted accumulation of scientific knowledge, engineering skill, and capital.
So the conflict is only apparent, not structural. Both views are valid.
They're both valid. We just use the discontinuous model because our purpose is to study the mechanism of the cycle, the boom and bust phases that are generated by the mass introduction of these discontinuous leaps.
And the cycle exists because that leap requires disruptive credit creation, and then later it generates a disruptive collapse in prices.
Precisely. We acknowledge the long, continuous history that makes the discontinuous leap possible, but we have to focus on the leap itself, because that is the point of economic disequilibrium that generates the financial and industrial wave.
All right, with that intellectual toolkit ready, let's finally get into the history. Let's locate this first long wave, K1. We've bracketed this era, provisionally, as 1787 to 1842.
That 55-year period is our starting line because it's the first wave that, it admits what we can call a reasonably clear statistical description. We have enough quantitative data, even if it's messy and fragmented, to track the flow of credit, production, and prices.
The dates themselves are a bit fuzzy, though.
Oh, inherently fuzzy. The start date, 1787, is sitting right after the U.S. political settlement, amid all these early industrial stirrings. The end date, 1842, that rests on a confluence of statistical and industrial facts, particularly the exhaustion of that initial growth phase in cotton and iron technology.
And this timeline immediately forces us to redefine something we all learned in school, the Industrial Revolution. We're taught it was this massive sudden burst of creativity right in the 1780s.
That view is it's inadequate for cyclical study. Tugendbaranowski, one of the early cycle theorists, he argued that if you absolutely must localize the Industrial Revolution into a specific time frame, it might be more accurately placed in the second quarter of the 19th century than in the late 18th.
So the 1820s and 30s.
Yes, and this aligns perfectly with the Schumpeterian view of the cycle.
Okay, let's unpack that alignment. The initial great achievements, Arkwright's factories, the first applications of steam, the start of the canals, those happened during the K1 prosperity phase, the late 1780s and 1790s.
Right. Those are the initial sparks. But those sparks didn't reorganize society overnight. The great achievements that were initiated in that prosperity phase, they actually matured and fully developed during the phases that came after.
During the recession, depression, and recovery phases.
Exactly. During that prolonged, interrupted downturn that lasted from roughly 1815 until the early 1840s.
So the Depression was actually the Industrial Revolution's cleanup crew.
That's a perfect way to put it. Precisely. That long, difficult period was essential. It was the phase where the economic system was reorganized from the ground up. Obsolete pre-K1 elements, like many artisanal workshops or uncompetitive farming regions, were eliminated.
And the new stuff got stronger.
The new industrial centers and factories that were built during the boom, they were forced to rationalize, to cut costs, to innovate further, and to fully exploit the new technological opportunities. The Depression wasn't some unfortunate political accident. It was the consequence of the industrial restructuring process itself. It was required to cement the K1 innovations into the very fabric of the economy.
That is a fundamental reframing for anyone listening. The hard times. The hard times were actually proof that the new industrial structure was successfully taking root, not proof that it was failing.
Absolutely. Think of it like hardening concrete. You pour it during the boom, but it gains its real strength under pressure and stress of the Depression. The stress test of the 1820s and 1830s ensured that only the most efficient mechanized factories survived, and that set the stage for the next great boom.
Now we have to address the elephant in the room for this period, external interference. The sources are very clear that external factors just dominated the economic curves until about 1820. We're talking about the international wars from 1793 to 1815.
The figure of Napoleon. He's the canonical example of an external factor, just an absolute total disruption of international commerce. So the analytical challenge for us is to figure out if the economic process continued on its own path, sui generis, driven by its own internal rhythm, or if the wars actually created the economic conditions we see.
It's an optical illusion problem, isn't it? A spectacular war ends and a depression follows. It's just so easy to assume the first thing caused the second.
We have to resist that ease. The source material points out that in 1806, England was actually experiencing pretty robust prosperity despite a highly uncomfortable international situation. This suggests the underlying industrial momentum was strong enough to override temporary political setbacks.
So how do we classify the war's effects then?
We classify them primarily as wear and tear, dislocation, and inflation caused by war financing, but not as the generator of the fundamental long-wave rhythm itself.
Let's focus on the U.S. experience because it had its own unique interference. Initially, American commercial sectors, shipping, transit trade, they saw a massive, unexpected boom because the European powers were all locked in conflict.
A huge windfall. And that windfall of profits from high freight rates provided essential liquid capital. It fueled enterprise that might not have existed otherwise. But then as political tensions rose, you get the Embargo Acts and the War of 1812, which just completely shut down that commercial activity.
And that led to a very severe depression lasting until about 1821.
A very deep one. So how do we separate the political shock, the embargo, the war, from the structural correction of the K1 recession? This is where I struggle to separate correlation from causation. If the political shock was that severe, isn't it statistically impossible to isolate the K1 component?
That's an excellent point, and the data is extremely complicated. There's no clean signal. However, the source material argues that the underlying depression was inevitable regardless of the war.
How so?
The war had spurred this temporary protected industrial boom in the U.S. You had factories that only existed because British goods couldn't get through. When peace returned and those tariff walls proved inadequate, those inefficient wartime industries were liquidated. The depth and the duration of that 1814-1821 depression is only truly understandable when you place it in its proper context, which is the K1 long-wave recessionary phase. That phase mandated the elimination of obsolete, costly production methods. The war just created a lot more of them to be eliminated.
So the political event, the war, was like an accelerator pedal that got stuck down. It briefly overinflated the industrial sector. Right.
And then the eventual structural correction was just that much more violent because the overexpansion had been so much greater.
Exactly. The economy was kicked around by the war, for sure, but its inherent cyclical component, the need for new innovations to rationalize and for old debt to be liquidated, that asserted itself with a vengeance afterward. Political events merely intensified and complicated the liquidation process.
Okay, let's pivot to the physical reality of K1, the leading innovations. What industrial clusters actually drove this cycle, especially in the U.S.?
Initially, you have to remember, the U.S. economy was agrarian and commercial. Industrial production was mostly done in the household or in small artisan workshops. It existed largely outside the cyclical repercussions of international finance.
But that started to change.
It started to shift around 1786. It was catalyzed by state incentives, things like land grants, loans, subsidies, all aimed at transforming those workshops into factories, consciously mimicking the English model.
And the core industrial cluster was textiles. That was the leading edge.
Without a doubt. The powered machinery for cotton and wool was the revolutionary element. This culminates in what the sources call the cotton mania of the 1790s. The Beverly Cotton Manufactory in 1789, while not the absolute first, it really symbolizes the beginning of that transition to organized, mechanized production.
And crucially, this industrial growth was fundamentally linked to a specific energy source.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's one we often overlook in favor of steam when we talk about the Industrial Revolution.
Water power.
Water power. It's a mistake to underestimate it for K1, particularly in the U.S. Water power remained the primary source of industrial energy right until the end of this period. The great foundational projects like Alexander Hamilton's vision for the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures at Passaic Falls and Paterson, New Jersey.
Right.
And later, the entire development of industrial towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, they were all predicated on harnessing huge volumes of hydraulic power.
So the innovation wasn't always inventing a brand new device. It was often institutional and infrastructural innovation. It was the systematic application of existing English technology like Arkwright's frames, which were often smuggled over and scaling it up with centralized, powerful hydraulic energy.
It was a revolution in scale, in organization, and in localization. The sheer energy demands of the new factory system concentrated manufacturing geographically around these reliable water sources. And this reliance on water power also explains the very slow adoption of steam.
Why was steam adoption so slow? We tend to think of James Watt and steam engines as being synonymous with this whole era.
And they were, but steam power was slow to gain quantitative significance in the U.S. for two main reasons. First, the abundance of cheap, reliable water power just made steam a less economical choice for stationary factory work.
The numbers didn't add up.
Not for a factory that could be built on a river. Second, the cost of coal freight was extraordinarily high. This meant steam only really made financial sense if you were right near a cheap coal field, or in specialized mobile applications, the most notable one being steamboats, after about 1810.
So steam was growing, but water power was the dominant driver.
For stationary industry in K1, absolutely.
Okay, let's consider iron, this sort of skeletal structure of the industrial economy.
The iron industry had to expand significantly during that 1790s upswing. It had to meet the demand for all this new machinery, pipes, factory components. Key technological improvements like the puddling process for making wrought iron, they diffused over from England, arriving in 1817.
But not steel.
Not really. High-quality, large-scale steel production, things like crucible steel or cast steel, that did not achieve quantitative importance within this first wave. It was still what we'd call development derived from foreign innovation and growing domestic demand. It really matured during the long recessionary phase.
So the third major K1 innovation is transport. And this brings us away from the factory floor and into infrastructure. We're talking about the canal boom.
Yes. Canal construction was the genuinely revolutionary K1 innovation in transport. It primarily accelerated after 1820. And the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, is the absolute textbook example of how innovation fundamentally works within the cycle.
How does the Erie Canal capture the essence of innovation better than, say, a power loom?
Because it immediately and demonstrably created both prosperity and depression at the same time, which is the defining characteristic of disruptive innovation.
Unpack that for us.
The canal drastically lowered transport costs between the East Coast and the Midwest. I mean, by as much as 90% in some cases. This created massive prosperity in new regions. It triggered rapid settlement and explosive growth in states like Ohio and Illinois.
Okay, that's the prosperity part.
But By delivering Western produce and raw materials so much cheaper, it decimated the local farming economies in places like upstate New York and New England that just couldn't compete anymore. It forced a deep structural depression in those older regions.
It's the perfect illustration of Schumpeter's creative destruction in action. The competition between the new function-cheap canal transport and the old function, which was wagon freight and local farming.
Exactly. Innovation always creates winners and losers. And the liquidation of the losers is just as important to the cyclical mechanism as the expansion of the winners.
And while canals defined K1 transport, what about railroads? We associate them so heavily with the mid-19th century.
And for good reason. Railroads were a clear, nascent innovation of the next Kondratieff cycle of K2. While they did begin to appear, there were about 4,000 miles of track operational by 1842. They were not yet a dominant, rationalizing force in the K1 economy.
So what was their significance in this period then?
Their primary significance within the K1 timeframe was financial. They contributed enormously to the speculative environment of the 1837 crisis. They were often coupled with reckless banks and mortgage companies in this pure anticipatory fever, rather than being part of a mature industrial operation.
So canals restructured the geography of K1, railroads structured the speculative mania that ended it.
That is a concise and very accurate summary. The earliest railroads were mostly localized, short-haul projects, often just attempts by cities like Baltimore to compete with the established dominance of canals in other centers. They were proof that the K2 mechanism was already generating early financial opportunities and, yes, speculative bubbles, long before the technology was mature enough to rationalize the whole transport network.
This entire structure, the factories, the canals, the early ironworks, it all emerged in an environment that historians universally describe as chaotic, volatile, and financially unsound. Let's dig into the character of this era. The infancy of capitalism and its reckless banking.
The financial landscape was volatile because it was immature. It was brand new. You had a scarcity of capital, extreme decentralization, and a continuation of the inflationary mindset that was common in colonial times. And all of this was amplified by a profound lack of any coherent national policy.
The numbers on banking growth are just staggering. You go from 21 banks in 1795 to 788 by 1837. This was decentralized, often speculative, state-chartered banking.
And these banks operated with minimal reserves. They were often lending on completely illiquid assets like long-term mortgages, and there was no coherent central bank system to impose any kind of discipline.
And the chaos wasn't an accident. The sources say state legislatures were actively promoting this.
They were. They promoted inflationary banking methods as a tool of public finance. For instance, Kentucky in 1820 created the Bank of the Commonwealth explicitly to issue paper money against mortgages, just to fund state projects and enterprises. Pennsylvania did similar things in 1840. Legislators were trying to stimulate economic activity by expanding credit, with very little regard for the consequences for liquidity or stability.
This is where we have to challenge the conventional view, the moralizing view. Sound money advocates of the era condemned all this as pure delinquency and fraud, and there was definitely fraud. But our framework forces us to ask, why was this reckless banking a necessary condition for K1?
The source material is quite clear on this. We have to distinguish between delinquency and function. Despite the fraud, despite the undeniable volatility, this system was the clearest historical example of innovation financing via mass credit creation. It served a vital, indispensable function.
Because the preceding era just hadn't generated enough accumulated wealth to fund the scale of industrialization that was required?
Precisely. The capital requirements for a canal network or a multi-story powered factory were enormous. They far exceeded the retained earnings or local savings capacity of the time. In the absence of sufficient accumulated results from pre-industrial evolution, this credit creation mechanism, even if performed by dozens of fragile, lightly regulated banks, was the only way to funnel purchasing power toward the new, risky industrial enterprises.
So the banks, by just issuing notes and extending credit on these thin reserves, were performing the essential function of transferring potential future purchasing power to the innovators of the present.
Yes. The high risk and the frequent failures were simply the cost of doing business at the frontier of industrial change. It was an expensive, messy, but necessary birth.
And the moral condemnation from sound money proponents at the time?
While completely understandable, given the violent crises they lived through, it often missed this structural necessity. They were, in a way, arguing against the mechanism of capitalist innovation itself, which absolutely demands credit expansion to fund discontinuity.
Let's connect this chaos to the broader policy environment. How did U.S. policy beyond state banking influence the K-1 structure? Let's look at tariffs in central banking policy.
Okay, tariffs first. The U.S. passed foundational tariffs in 1789 and then a more protectionist one in 1816. These were political acts, really. They were intended to sustain the industrial structures that had emerged during the war and the embargoes.
But did they drive the cycle?
No, not really. They didn't dominate the cyclical movement itself. They acted as a distortion in the data. By favoring specific industries that couldn't survive without protection, they probably softened recessions in those sectors and maybe accentuated subsequent booms. But they didn't generate the underlying K1 rhythm. They just created a somewhat distorted industrial organism. The cyclical engine was still innovation.
Now, Andrew Jackson, the conflict over the central bank. How did that political hostility toward financial control impact the K1 cycle?
This is a classic case of policy interfering with and intensifying a natural cyclical movement. The U.S. Constitution, it mandated sound monetary principles, but the federal government repeatedly failed to support the two banks of the United States in their efforts to exert any kind of central banking control.
And the Jackson administration's decision to veto the recharter of the second bank in 1833 and then remove the federal deposits, that was the critical moment.
It was a massive interference. By undermining the only institution that was capable of imposing any discipline on the state-chartered reckless banking, Jackson's policy directly fueled the speculative overshoot of the mid-1830s. It created the perfect conditions for the violence of the 1837 speculative collapse.
So the downturn, the structural correction, was coming anyway because K1 was maturing and needed liquidation. But the policy intervention turned what might have been a severe but manageable juggler correction into a spectacular, faith-shattering crisis.
Exactly. It's essential for understanding that policy doesn't usually create the long wave movement, but it can certainly modulate its intensity, especially during that liquidation phase.
Let's delve deeper into that modulation by looking at the shorter cycles, the Juglar and Kitchin cycles that were operating within this K1 long wave. This turbulence really defined the early decades.
Locating the juggler cycles, the medium-term 9 to 11-year waves, is exceptionally challenging before 1820. Just exceptionally. The massive external political and war factors we already discussed, especially the shifts in U.S. neutrality, the embargoes, the war, they just dominate the aggregate economic curves. They essentially mask the underlying juggler rhythm.
So we have to rely on fragmented industrial histories and local accounts to even try to put some dates on it.
We do, and it's very tentative. But the first half of K1 might be broken down something like this. You have a Prosperity 1, roughly 1787 to 1794. This is driven by the initial cotton and hydraulic power installations. That's followed by a really messy recession and recovery phase from 1795 to 1804, which was hit by everything from corsairs to the devastating effect of the Peace of Amiens in 1802.
Then a second prosperity, 1805 to 1813, but that one was highly distorted.
Distortion is the key word. Industrial development did continue, driven by the need to substitute for imports you couldn't get. But commerce was heavily depressed by Jefferson's embargoes and the war itself. Then we finally enter the long depression and liquidation phase of K1, lasting from 1814 to 1822. This culminates in the deep crisis of 1818, which was the final liquidation of all the irregularities that had accumulated during the Napoleonic era boom.
That initial 35 years is a powerful argument for anyone who denies cycles exist, because the aggregate data is just so messy. The external shock argument looks very convincing until you dig deeper.
Precisely. It demonstrates that aggregate curves can be a very insecure guide. However, the underlying industrial life was demonstrably strong. Industrial centers, the new manufacturing towns, they continued to build capacity, often even while commercial and financial centers were suffering. Especially in the South, where cotton production for export fueled prosperity, regardless of what was happening with northern banking.
The cyclical pattern, however, starts to assert itself much more clearly once the political environment stabilizes after 1820.
Yes. Once the war-induced distortions finally recede, the internal rhythm of the K1 long wave becomes undeniable. We can clearly identify the next two juggler cycles.
Juglar 5, or J5, from 1823 to 1831. This is the era that's dominated by the massive canal construction boom.
That was a textbook juggler expansion. It was funded by credit and driven by a cluster of huge infrastructural innovations. It generated widespread prosperity and significant, though localized, speculative activity.
And then we get Juglar 6, J6, from 1832 to 1842, and this one contains the spectacular peak and crash that often defines the end of K1 in the public memory.
J6 was highly irregular. The peak was defined by unchecked speculation. The 1837 panic was an enormous overshooting of a typical juggler expansion. It was fueled by that three-way speculative bubble involving railroads, new decentralized banks, and Western mortgage companies.
And this speculative frenzy was the direct result of that financial anarchy, the reckless banking, which was then exacerbated by the Jacksonian monetary policy that removed the only institutional brake on the system.
It was the ultimate, necessary, and violent liquidation. The general economic retrenchment of K1 had to happen regardless. The productivity gains from the canals and factories were already beginning to drive down prices. But the speculative overshoot made the resulting crisis far more violent and prolonged than it needed to be. The juggler cycle's function of liquidating the secondary expansion was just performed with extreme brutality.
So we have this long wave pattern, K1, structurally sound, marching along its predetermined path of innovation and saturation. But its surface manifestation is violently distorted by shorter cycles and massive political shocks. This brings us to our final point, confirmation. How does the historical reality of this messy period ultimately validate the triple wave schema?
The most compelling and I think the most impartial proof of the underlying structural rhythm comes from the behavior of the general price level.
If the volatility was only due to external factors, if it was all just war paper money and political inflation, the price level would be unpredictable. It would just be dictated by external government action.
Correct. But the evidence robustly supports the model. The domestic price level behaved exactly as you would expect in the triple wave model. It rose during the K1 prosperity phase, reflecting the expansion of credit and the high initial costs of innovation. And then it fell, sharply and consistently afterward, entering the long deflationary trend of the K1 recession and depression. And it did this despite the continual banking excesses and inflationary pushes.
This is the crucial, counterintuitive point we need to drive home for you listening. How can prices fall when you have hundreds of banks recklessly issuing credit and inflating the money supply?
Because the mechanism of innovation is more powerful than the mechanism of inflation over the long term. The enormous increase in production and output that resulted from the new cluster of K1 innovations, the sheer scale of the hydraulic factories, the dramatically lower transport costs from the canals, the cheaper cotton and iron, it ultimately outpaced the effects of the credit expansion.
So the supply shock, which was driven by the successful deployment of the new production function, was so massive that it exerted a greater long-term downward pressure on general prices than the temporary upward pressure from the expanded money supply.
That is the standard modus operandi of the innovation mechanism. The success of the K1 innovations led to massive increases in efficiency and supply, which forced general prices down as production costs plummeted. This long-term behavior of prices, which synchronized remarkably well between the U.S. and Britain throughout this era, validates the existence of the autonomous K1 structural rhythm far better than any explanation that relies solely on national, non-cyclical external shocks.
That synchronization is key. If U.S. prices were driven only by Jackson's policies or local tariffs, and U.K. prices were only driven by Napoleonic war debt, they shouldn't follow the same 55-year trend of rise and fall. But they did.
Because the underlying structural industrial reorganization was transnational. It was driven by the steam engine, by cotton technology, and by new organizational methods, regardless of which side of the Atlantic you happen to be on.
So in synthesis, the historical facts spanning 1787 to 1842, from the textile factory mania to the Canal Revolution, they show that economic evolution does proceed in these massive, long waves of industrial restructuring. Even when the picture is heavily distorted by political warfare and volatile, nascent financial institutions, the underlying rhythm is detectable and it's predictable.
The infancy of capitalism was marked by a necessary institutional chaos, a chaos required to fund essential, risky innovation. The violent downturns were not political aberrations. They were the consequence of an industrial organism that was successfully executing a massive technological transformation. We have, I think, successfully verified the triple wave schema for the first long cycle.
Considering the volatility of the K1 era, where reckless banking was the necessary evil required to fund foundational yet risky innovation, what modern financial technology or asset class is currently playing the role of that volatile frontier financing entity today? We'll leave that for you to mull over.
That is a question we must always ask ourselves when we study historical cycles. Is our current chaos actually a prerequisite for the next great wave?
With the first wave complete, in our next episode, episode 8, we will move into the golden age of expansion. The second Kondratieff, K2, covering the years 1843 to 1913, and the innovations of the railroad, steel, and electricity from Chapter 7.